Hey everyone, I'm RV Micah, and welcome to my show, where nothing is sacred, but nothing is beyond saving either. And if there's one thing you should know about me right off the bat, it's that I love villains. Well, okay, I don't love villains, they're horrible people, but I do love talking about villains. I don't know, there's just something about them I find compelling. Maybe it's the idea that every villain is a dark reflection of their hero. Maybe it's the tragedy of a man casting aside their morality and becoming a monster. I just find them fun to analyze. You know what else I love? Final Fantasy. You see, when I was a little kid, Final Fantasy X came out. And ever since I played that, I've grown to have something of a special love for the Final Fantasy series. I've played pretty much every game in the series, the main ones anyway, and I loved all of them. And I loved most of them. I mean, yeah, I don't love every game in this series equally, but Final Fantasy, to me at least, has always been more than the sum of its parts. It's been with me since childhood, and with Final Fantasy VII Remake on the horizon and Final Fantasy XIV still going strong, it's safe to say it's going to stick around for quite a bit longer. So I thought to myself one day, both of these things are things that I love talking about, so why not combine them? Which is why, all throughout the month of October, I'm going to be discussing the top 30 best villains that this series has given us. Let me lay down the ground rules. I'll be releasing one a day throughout the month of October, kind of like an advent calendar, but for Halloween. I actually did the same thing on my nerd blog last year that hasn't been updated in like half a year, but since then my opinions have shifted, and I feel confident enough to express them in video form now. There really aren't any rules about who can or can't be on this list other than as long as they're a villain or an antagonist from a Final Fantasy game, they're eligible. I am, however, going to impose a limit of 4 villains per game, otherwise they'd all be from 14. I'll be judging each villain based on 6 criteria: intimidation, motivation, personality, competence, presence, and combat. That's really all I have to go over for now, and I can't wait to get started proper. So, I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you tomorrow. Let's start this countdown off with the villain of Final Fantasy XI, the Shadow Lord. His backstory is kinda complicated, so I'll do my best to abridge it. Also, just for the record, I never actually played that much of 11, so I apologize in advance if I get stuff wrong. The Shadow Lord was once a man named Raugrim. Raugrim is a Galka, which are basically the most heavily persecuted race in Vana'diel, the world of 11. And not only that, but he's what's known as the Talekeeper, which means he carries with him the ancestral memory of his people. So, as you can imagine, he's kinda got a lot of baggage carrying around the memories of an oppressed people. This experience gave him sort of a unique empathy for the Beastmen, the recurring enemies of Final Fantasy XI, and this ended up causing a rift between him and his best friend, who eventually betrayed and killed him. After all of this took place, his sadness and anger manifested in a powerful new form called the Shadow Lord, who took command of the Beastmen to form an army and exact his revenge on Vana'diel. Right off the bat, the Shadow Lord is one of the more menacing figures in the Final Fantasy Rogues Gallery. I mean, just look at him! That thing ain't a letter opener. His design is just really cool. He's got this sort of demonic look going for him. And while most villains in his position would have big, scary armor, the Shadow Lord has this really creepy, bony exoskeleton thing, and it looks really cool and creepy. What's more, even though he's definitely no pushover in hand-to-hand combat, the characters of 11 fear him more for his military prowess than his own fighting abilities. See, most Final Fantasy villains are either lone wolves, armchair generals, or abominations from beyond space and time, so to see an overlord who rides into battle at the head of his troops is something surprisingly rare for this series. However, while I've gone on and on about how cool and intimidating he is, he hasn't really got much in the way of personality. I mean, yeah, Raugrim had personality, but once the Shadow Lord awakens, he's just the physical manifestation of Raugrim's anger. So, anger is really all the emotion he gets. Then again, how much subtlety can you really expect from a character whose name is Shadow Lord? His backstory may be complex, but his character really isn't. Even still, he's a cool concept executed reasonably well, and he's a worthy final opponent for vanilla Final Fantasy XI, and a perfect starting point for this countdown. I suppose compared to the Shadow Lord, the CEO of an energy conglomerate probably isn't the most intimidating figure to go on this list, but I guess big business is the true evil, so he fits right in. The Shinra company generates power by harnessing the life energy of the planet itself to create Mako energy, an incredibly powerful source of energy that gives people the ability to use magic. Also, it kills the planet, but never mind that. As a result, the Shinra Corporation is so massive that it might as well be an evil empire, and its president the most powerful man on the planet. When its president gets murdered by a certain katana-wielding lunatic who may or may not be on this list later on, his son, Rufus Shinra, takes charge of the company. The thing that makes Rufus such an effective antagonist is just how calm, casual, and collected he is about everything. He's completely unfazed by everything and anything that happens to him, and he's really good about adapting his plans to fit the situation. He always comes across as being in control of the situation, regardless of how much control he actually does have. Early on, Rufus explains to the heroes that while his father may have controlled people with money and empty promises, Rufus controls people with fear. We see that at play multiple times throughout the game when he plays on people's fear of larger threats, like that meteor about to kill the planet, or that eco-terrorist group trying to take the company down, or the aforementioned lunatic with a sword. We also really get the sense that his approach to getting things done is vastly different from his father. The old president is usually content to sit back and watch other people do stuff, but you get the impression that Rufus is a much more proactive, do-things-yourself kind of guy. He thinks nothing of making sacrifices for the sake of maintaining control, and he has a certain presence that can be felt anytime Shinra's actions are the focus of a scene, which is a lot of the time. Every action he takes is deliberate and part of a much grander whole. Really, the only thing holding him back from being higher on this list is his overall lack of screen time. I mean, even when he's first introduced early on in the game, it's clear there are bigger fish to fry. Rufus just never gets to be the main thread of the game. Even later on, when he kicks things into high gear, everyone's more concerned about that meteor that's about to kill everyone. But it's not for lack of trying on his part. In another game, he easily could have been main villain material, and even as it stands, he isn't half bad. It's just kind of a shame that he had to share a game with a much more effective villain. Hey, remember that time he was carrying around the severed head of an alien god in a jar? That was weird.
You have grown very thin, Bosch.
Okay, tell me if the plot of Final Fantasy XII sounds a little familiar. It's about a princess who leads a rebellion against an evil empire alongside a naive blonde kid with dreams of adventure and a dashing rogue and his furry co-pilot. Yeah, that does sound a lot like Star Wars, doesn't it? And you can rest assured that this game does have its Darth Vader analog in the form of Judge Gabranth. Born under the name Noah von Ronsenberg, he and his twin brother Bosch lived in the Republic of Landis before it was invaded by the Arcadian Empire, and they fought valiantly to defend their homeland. And lost. Bosch fled to the Kingdom of Dalmasca to continue the fight against the Empire, but Noah cut his losses, embraced the occupation, and, along with his sickly mother, whose maiden name he adopted, moved to the imperial capital of Arcades, where he joined the military and climbed the ranks until he reached the rank of Judge Magister. A rank he earned through being completely and utterly ruthless.
He is an enemy of the Empire. He will be cut down.
So you would kill even your own brother for the Empire?
What makes Gabranth interesting is how conflicted he is. On the one hand, he harbors a deep hatred for Bosch for abandoning him and his mother to fight for Dalmasca, but on the other hand, he's got a deep sense of self-loathing about failing to defend Landis, and feels as though he hasn't got any honor left to lose. And because he doesn't feel as though he has any honor left, he can be absolutely sadistic when he wants to be. Case in point, early on in the game he disguises himself as Bosch to frame him for the assassination of Dalmasca's king. That done, he keeps Bosch in prison despite the fact that the public thinks that he was executed, just so he can rub it in his face how Dalmasca is doing under the Imperial occupation. Later on, he tries to manipulate the protagonist, Ash, into starting a war by revealing that he killed her father in the first place. He wasn't following orders there, by the way, he was just dissatisfied with the Empire and he's just being petty. But like I said, Gabranth is a very conflicted character, so there are depths that even he hesitates to sink to, and his better nature does shine through when he's acting as the bodyguard to Larsa, who's basically the purest little cinnamon roll ever. And he does fight alongside the heroes during the final battle, which is pretty cool. It's just kind of a shame that for how cool and imposing he is when he's on the side of evil, the fights against him are absolutely pathetic. You fight him a couple times throughout the game, and each and every time he's an absolute cakewalk. Heck, you fight him right before you get to the final boss gauntlet, and he's little more than a warm-up. Despite this, what sets him apart are his conflicted motivations, his relationship with the main cast, and his big, scary design, which you might recognize from the game's logo. I don't have much else to say about him, just as far as Darth Vader clones go, I've seen worse. I'm probably going to get a ton of flack for putting these guys so far down the list, and for having 2 entries from 7 so far down for that matter. But as much as I like these guys as characters, they are, at the end of the day, just henchmen, so it's no surprise they'd rank below some of the heavy hitters on this list. It's basically a law that any RPG has to have a quirky set of minor villains to face, and the Turks fill that role for 7. Remember the Shinra Corporation from when I talked about Rufus? Well, say hello to their secret police, the Turks. They do a little bit of everything. Spy work, sabotage, kidnapping, the occasional murder, that sort of thing. These are the guys who do Shinra's dirty work, and not only do they do it well, but they do it in style. You run across the team, or members of it at least, throughout the game, and each one of them has their own memorable personality quirks. There's Reno, the cool, level-headed, cynical, experienced one. There's Elena, the naive, inexperienced one. There's Rude, the quiet, serious one who deep down is just as much of a dork as the rest of them. And then there's Song, the leader who certainly exists. But aside from Song, who is so forgettable that the English dub accidentally killed him, every single one of the members is unique, memorable, and really fun to fight also. But their best moments aren't even the times where they're fighting against the heroes. Most of the time, their best moments are the ones where they're just hanging around and doing their thing. At one point before you fight them, you catch them casually discussing who they have a crush on, and in another instance, they don't even bother trying to fight you just because they're on break. They're so likable and charming, in fact, that you'll honestly forget that Reno dropped an entire city on another city and killed thousands of people just to get 6 guys. 3 of whom escaped, and the other 3 were already dead or dying. So, blowing up the plate accomplished nothing. Didn't I say that they were good at their jobs a minute ago? Whatever. But honestly, their shining moment out of all of this is their role in the Wutai side quest, when they team up with the heroes to rescue Elena. This whole scene is completely optional, but it's really nice to see this whole new side to the Turks and how much they really care about one another. And if you do go this route, you can actually talk your way out of the final battle with them late in the game. In the end, they're fun, endearing, and just so darn human that I feel really guilty about leaving them this low on the list. But like I said before, there's only so high a group of henchmen can get, so while they may not rank that high as villains, as characters, they're part of what makes 7 so great, and I wouldn't have the game without them.
Monster! People are not yours to use!
What else does one do with tools?
So for the longest time, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to put this guy on the list, because while I do think he does a lot of interesting stuff as a villain, I also have some issues with the way he's written. But in the end, I think he's pretty cool. So yeah, this is going to require a bit of backstory. After the deity responsible for the creation of XIII's world finished their work, they departed this plane of existence and left the world in the care of godlike mechanical beings called the fal'Cie. The problem is, the fal'Cie aren't exactly happy with having to babysit humanity. In fact, they can't even be bothered to do their jobs most of the time. Instead, they imbue their power in humans, branding them as fal'Cie, and make them do whatever the fal'Cie want. All the fal'Cie want is for the Maker to return and for them to not have to be stuck watching humans all the time. Enter Barthandelus. He has a plan to bring the Maker back. How, you may ask? Well, they have a theory that when a person dies, their soul travels down the same road the Maker did after they finished creating the world. So, under the human guise of Primarch Gabranth Dycedarg, Barthandelus rules the floating colony known as Cocoon, and his plan is to ensure that it prospers and its population grows massive enough that Barthandelus can destroy the entire thing and kill everyone on it. The idea being that eventually the Maker will have to come back to figure out why 1 billion people are all banging on his front door at once. Despite all my issues with XIII's story, I gotta give credit where credit is due. That's one of the more unique motivations I've seen from a Final Fantasy villain. If I'm being honest, that's the entire reason he's even on this list to begin with. I'll admit, though, a lot of my problems with him are more the writing of the game's fault than his own. For example, the game makes a pretty big deal about how manipulative he is and how he's been pulling the strings since day one. However, we see very little of that in action. He does manipulate the main party, but mostly it just boils down to him telling the heroes exactly what his plans are, and telling them what to do, and they go right where he expects them to and somehow think they're foiling his plans by doing so. However, his manipulative nature does shine through on occasion, and we do get to see his cunning on full display. For example, throughout XIII we have a resistance faction called the Cavalry who fight against the fal'Cie rule. How does Barthandelus deal with this? Well, as Primarch, he actually steps down from his position of power and appoints as his successor the leader of the Cavalry, which causes the whole group to think that he's turned traitor and destabilize as a result. That's actually pretty clever. There's also this bit where, by employing
the magic of illusion,
he disguises himself as supporting character Sarah to try to talk the main characters out of resisting him, all while getting touchy-feely with Snow, who's the real Sarah's fiancé. That is gross and creepy on so many levels, and I absolutely friggin' love it. He's also really powerful as an antagonist, but honestly, I'd argue he's a little too powerful. There are a couple instances where the heroes do battle against him, but after the fight he's just like, "Wahaha, you can't touch me," after both of them. And yeah, he is basically a godlike being fighting against normal humans, but this isn't the way you'd go about it. Remember Beatrix from Final Fantasy IX? Every time you fought against her, the party was absolutely friggin' annihilated. But this plays out less like the party being way outclassed and more like a normal boss fight that just doesn't amount to anything. The party isn't completely annihilated and Barthandelus isn't set back in any way, so the fight might as well have not even happened. It doesn't exactly help that his design isn't really all that intimidating. I mean, his human form looks fine, he is Super Pope after all, but then he reveals his true form in all of its fal'Cie glory and... what even is that? It looks like Ganon from The Wind Waker stuck his face on a pipe organ. It just doesn't look very menacing. It looks silly. I know I've been sounding kind of negative throughout this entry, but I do think that Barthandelus is worth talking about for his cool concept, unique motivation, and occasional bouts of cunning. I just feel like he could have used a few more shining moments to truly be considered one of Final Fantasy's great bad guys. Final Fantasy Tactics is a completely different animal from most other games in the series, not just because of the gameplay, but because of the story. The conflict in Tactics is the result of a series of power plays between various kingdoms, noble families, and the stand-in for the Catholic Church trying to gain control of the land of Ivalice. Think of it like Final Fantasy's equivalent of Game of Thrones. And one of those major players is Dycedarg Beoulve. Dycedarg, I'm just gonna call him Dycedarg, I have no idea how to pronounce it, there's no voice acting. Dycedarg is the eldest son of the Beoulves, a noble family famous for producing some of the kingdom's finest knights and greatest heroes, and on top of that he's the former leader of the Order of the Northern Sky. After he poisoned his father to gain control over the house, he allies himself with Duke Lard in the latter's plot to install his nephew Prince Orneus on the throne of Ivalice and therefore rule as regent. However, Dycedarg himself is just using Lard for his own gain, but he nonetheless goes along with the plan anyway to try to abduct the other potential heir, and when the War of Succession finally does break out, and circumstances allow it, Dycedarg stabs Larg in the back in order to make his move on the regency himself. Dycedarg is one of the most Machiavellian villains in the entire series, and like I said before, he'd be right at home in Game of Thrones. He's manipulative, self-serving, charismatic, and really good at playing the long game. Whether it be allying himself with Larg to slowly gain the latter's trust, or poisoning his father over time to avoid arousing suspicion, never let it be said that this man is impatient. Then there's his design. His appearance and mannerisms aren't really even that evil looking, but even before his true colors are revealed, he has an air of authority around him that makes it clear that he's not to be trifled with. It really does feel like he has a specific plan for every possible outcome, even if there isn't much to his motivations aside from wanting more power. There's a ton going on for this guy, so why is he so low on the list? Well, he suffers from a problem that the entire game suffers from. You see, like I mentioned before, this game is centered around a complex political power struggle that's really down to earth, complex, and feels like it could have happened in the real world. Towards the end of the game, it's revealed that the real instigator of the conflict was the Church of Saint Ajora. However, they're not in it for political power. Oh no. Led by the head of the Knights Templar and ostensibly the main villain of the game, Volmar of Tengil, the Church's whole goal in the game is to use the competing sides to gather the Zodiac Stones to resurrect their Dark Lord, Ultima. So yes, this morally grey story of Realpolitik is reduced to Evil Man Wants Magic Rock. What does this have to do with Dycedarg? Well, the conspirators all turn out to be possessed by Ultima's demonic servants, the Lusavi, and during the end of the game, Dycedarg is possessed by one of them, so the conflict with him doesn't really feel like it resolved properly. This sort of thing is handled a lot better by another Tactics villain later on the list, but for Dycedarg, it just falls a bit flat. The final fight with him isn't even that challenging. Despite the fact that the narrative chickens out at the last second, Dycedarg is a really compelling villain, despite his lack of complexity. To me, Dycedarg seems like a microcosm of Tactics as a whole. His potential is wasted in his final moments, but for the most part, he succeeds on pretty much every level.
The soul of strife shall endure forever, beyond time and space.
This countdown just wouldn't be complete if I didn't bring up the original Final Fantasy villain, Garland. He might be from an old game, but he's still worth discussing, I think. At the start of the game, Garland is a rogue knight of the Kingdom of Cornelia, who kidnaps Princess Sarah in an attempt to ransom her for the throne. The Warriors of Light are dispatched to rescue her, but in spite of his proclamation that he will knock them all down, Garland is soundly defeated. However, just before his death, he's saved by the Four Fiends, who bestow upon him great power and send him back 2,000 years into the past, where he became the demon Chaos. From there, he sent the Four Fiends of the past into the future, so they could wreak havoc on the world and eventually send Garland back in the first place. This creates a time loop that keeps Garland immortal, and allows him to achieve his ultimate goal of exacting his revenge on the Light Warriors for all eternity. You have to remember that Final Fantasy I came out at a time when video game plots didn't really go much beyond rescue princess and beat evil wizard. But then along comes Garland, and even though he does kidnap a princess, this happens in the first hour of the game and he's immediately forgotten. Up until the end of the game anyway, when we find out about both his survival and the time loop in a plot twist that honestly still holds up pretty well to this day. His motivation, later on in the game at least, isn't exactly complex or sympathetic, but it's really interesting when you stop to think about it. Keeping in mind the time loop, if his plan works out, he'll kill the Light Warriors, live for 2,000 more years, get sent back to do the whole thing over again. He doesn't want to merely get revenge. He wants to keep getting revenge on the Warriors of Light for the rest of time. That is hardcore. The combat against him is kind of a mixed bag. The first fight against Garland at the beginning of the game is pathetically easy, which is to be expected since he's the first major fight of the game, and the series for that matter. But when he transforms into the Demon Chaos, he really pulls out all the stops, especially in the remakes where he gets a ton of extra HP. I wasn't really sure how to rank him in terms of combat, considering the two fights are polar opposites, but considering that this is the first game in the series, and the easy first fight helps serve as the plot twist later on, I'll be a bit lenient here. And while it doesn't really affect his place on the list, he's given a lot of extra depth with his characterization in Dissidia Final Fantasy. In that game, he's completely obsessed with violence and war, and he uses the time loop as a means of constantly being able to fight for all eternity, not specifically for revenge. It's an interpretation of the character that you can read into the original if you so choose, so that has to count for something at least. Overall, Garland started a lot of trends in this series, like villains who screw with the space-time continuum, villains who wear menacing armor, and final fights involving some sort of big, scary transformation. He might not be the most complex villain out there, but he does hold a special place in the hearts of many fans of this series. You know, that knock you all down line might sound pretty silly, but just imagine how it would sound coming from Christopher Lee.
Rip them all down.
Not so laughable now, is it? Oh hey look, it's another 7 villain near the bottom of the list. I swear I'm not doing this on purpose despite 7, I really do like 7, okay? There's a big difference between Professor Hojo and the other 7 villains I've covered, the Turks and Rufus. The thing about Hojo is that he has absolutely no charisma, no style, nothing redeeming about his personality whatsoever. He is one of the most vile, disgusting, downright evil human beings to ever grace this series. Professor Hojo is the lead scientist of the Shinra Corporation, and let me tell you, this guy loves his job. But he also believed ethics have no place in science. This went so far as to inject alien cells into his pregnant wife's unborn son for the intent of creating a super soldier. The end result of which, you'll see later on. Despite the fact that he actually resigns from his position early on in the game, he shows up here and there throughout 7 and plays a key part in Shinra's activities. I wish I could go into more detail about his backstory, but there isn't really much to be found. He doesn't have any real excuse for any of the horrible, amoral things that he does. Why did he inject his pregnant wife with alien bits? Why did he attempt to breed a human being with a talking dog thing? Why did he turn humans into monstrous abominations?
Science, of course!
Overall, he's just a callous, disgusting human being. He constantly refers to Aerith and her mother as if they're animals, since they're technically not human. He seems to have a perverted streak if his beach groupies are any indication, and when the game's main character, Cloud, starts to believe he's a clone, Hojo knows full well it isn't true since he was the one who did those experiments, but plays along anyway just to spite him. The closest thing he has to a moment of compassion in the entire game is when he decides to devote his resources to helping his son destroy the planet. That's still pretty twisted, but at least he's supportive of his son's hobby. I don't really have much to say about Hojo since, compared to some of the other villains on this list, he is one of the least complex, but he is nonetheless incredibly memorable just because of his shocking lack of morality, and his role in the backstory. He really does make his mark. This video contains spoilers for Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. If you have not played Shadowbringers and want to remain unspoiled, now's your chance to get out.
Ah! It's them! The villains who would sow chaos in my perfect paradise! Keep them away from me! I command you! Keep them away!
You have no idea how hard it was to narrow down which villains from 14 would make it onto this list. As I mentioned before, I love this game, and there are a lot of villains that could have made the list, and it was really tough to narrow it down to 4, and I feel he's really worth talking about. The land of Norvrant has been plagued by creatures known as Sin Eaters, which used to be normal humans and animals until they were overwhelmed by the Flood of Light, turning them into mindless abominations who consume living ether from living beings, leaving only the light behind. However, in the city of Eulmore, a child was born who possessed the ability to control them. This is Vauthry. Vauthry was groomed from a young age to be worshipped as a holy king for his power, and as a result of that, he became a despot who sought to bring the world under his rule in a supposedly holy paradise, all while indulging in a life of self-gratification and pleasure. Just looking at this hedonistic man-child, you'd think he'd be an utterly laughable villain. And yeah, he does have quite a few funny moments, particularly when things don't get his way and he just completely loses his cool.
I'll kill them! I'll kill them all! I'll enslave their minds! I'll torment them! Torture them!
But for my money, there's never been a villain in the entire series more unsettling and yet more pitiful than Vauthry. Like I said before, he was basically raised specifically to make him into a megalomaniac. Ever since he was a little kid, he was conditioned to think that it was his place to indulge himself and dictate the fate of the world. It's pretty clear that he's always been at the whims of those who wanted to use him for their own personal gain, like the guy who gave him his powers to begin with, or his parents who saw them as their ticket to wealth and power. But don't misunderstand, he's not being controlled by anybody, and the things he does are downright horrific. You find out towards the end of Shadowbringers that the food he serves in his city is laced with a mind control drug that makes the citizens completely subservient to him, basically giving him a mindless, perfectly subservient army. Also, it's Soylent Green. It's also here where you find out that Vauthry's basically a Sin Eater himself, and while the original reveal is understated and honestly kinda hilarious,
Look, I'm a beautiful butterfly!
when you do get to fight him, he eventually transforms into his ultimate form, which, in comparison to his normal form, looks...
Oh no, he's hot!
in a fight which is honestly pretty insane. I mean, just look at this. I have no idea how I managed to dodge half of this. But like I said before, while I mostly alternated between laughing at him and throwing up, the emotion I felt towards him at the end of the day, above all else, is pity. He's an evil scumbag, sure, but he's also the product of people who only wanted to use him, morphing him to a self-righteous glutton who didn't know any better because this is all he knows. Or maybe he's just an a-hole, that's also a possibility. I'm gonna be totally honest here, I almost didn't include this guy on the list for reasons that I'm gonna get into. A lot like Gabranth, Golbez has a lot of Darth Vader influence going for him. In his bid to gain control of the world's elemental crystals, he took control of the military superpower Baron using magic and subterfuge. With Baron's resources and his own considerable power, he proceeded to steamroll every other nation and take the crystals like the government takes our money, all the while outsmarting and outplaying the main characters at every turn. I can't stress just how scarily competent this guy is. It doesn't feel like he's a boring, invincible villain like Barthandelus. Rather, his competence comes from his refusal to succumb to the cliches that have felled better villains than he. He makes sure to neutralize threats against him the second he becomes aware of them. He's more than willing to get his own hands dirty instead of relying on his minions all the time, and he knows exactly how to manipulate the main character's emotions. That's not even taking into account how powerful he is. At one point, he gets absolutely destroyed by the heroes in a battle, and gets beaten so badly that all that's left of him afterwards is his hand, which he then manages to completely regenerate himself from. But not before doing this.
They're creepy and they're kooky, mysterious and spooky. They're all together ooky, the Addams Family.
It also helps that even compared to some of the other armored villains this series has, his design is really cool. You can really see the Darth Vader influence in this guy. He's also got really cool theme music, and he totally owns how diabolical and evil he is. And the way he does it is less cartoonish and just adds to his intimidation factor instead. With all of this going for him, you have a character who would easily make the top 10. If it weren't for the fact that it turns out that this whole time he was being controlled by a bigger, badder villain the whole time. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with villains, and fiction in general, when it turns out an otherwise cool villain wasn't even a villain to begin with and was just actually being brainwashed. It robs him of any and all build-up, and the actual villain, Zemus, has almost no build-up and is a far less effective villain. Can you imagine how lame Darth Vader would have been if the Emperor was actually just mind-controlling him the whole time? It gets really silly when you get later in the game and realize that Zemus was mind-controlling Golbez, who was mind-controlling Kain. Now, to Golbez's credit, the remake adds a lot of extra scenes fleshing out his backstory, and it reveals that, yeah, he did fall to the dark side before falling under the control of Zemus. And from what I can gather from interviews and the like, these bits were originally meant to be in the original, but they got left on the cutting room floor, so it's not like he had zero agency as a character. Golbez also gets points for his characterization in Dissidia, where he's basically recruited to the villain's side against his will and spends the entire game encouraging the heroes and insulting his own comrades.
Destruction will be your downfall.
Which is nice and all, but it doesn't really change the fact that in his original appearance, he's just being used as a puppet by some guy on the moon. With just a couple changes, he could have been one of the best villains in the entire series. But even in spite of that disappointing reveal, Golbez is one of the most memorable, smart, powerful, and downright scary villains in the entire series. Now, if only he was actually a villain, then we'd have something.
Beg your pardon, but that's not something a maester should say.
Then pretend I didn't say it.
You've probably seen the Antichrist in a lot of stories before. Now get ready to meet the Anti-Buddha. In order to understand Seymour, you need to understand the environment he grew up in. Seymour lives in the world of Spira, which is plagued by a being known as Sin, that keeps technological progress at a standstill by laying waste to entire cities, and can only be put down temporarily before it resumes its rampage. As such, Spira's civilization is trapped in an endless circle of death without an end in sight. Seymour is a hybrid between a human and a Guado, who are basically tree people, who was forced into hiding along with his mother because people couldn't accept their union. When Seymour's mother died and he was saddled with the responsibility to give his life on behalf of the people who rejected him, he eventually decided that life in Spira was nothing more than an endless cycle of suffering with no end, and the only release from that pain is death. So instead, he became a part of the clergy of the Church of Yevon to eventually find a way to gain control of Sin and put the whole world out of its misery. Seymour is incredibly nihilistic, even by Final Fantasy villain standards. Given his background and the environment Final Fantasy X takes place in, you can easily see his point of view and how he could come to the conclusion he did. In any other story, his ramblings about Death's sweet release would be crazy rambling, and it is, but in the context of Final Fantasy X, it isn't hard to see his point of view and sympathize to a degree. Another thing this guy has going for him are the many different varied battles against him. You fight him 4 times throughout the game, and all of them are stiff challenges that take full advantage of every aspect of the game's battle system. In the first fight against him, he summons Anima, a huge, scary summoned monster that you saw before in cutscene and know just how powerful it is as it laid waste to an entire swarm of monsters, and to see it summoned against you is a huge wake-up call. The second fight is even more challenging and takes place in a critical turning point for the story. The third fight is utterly brutal, with an attack that zombifies the main characters so that healing spells will hurt them, and a moveset that takes full advantage of that fact. And the fourth fight is actually kind of a pushover, but at least the music slaps. You've been hearing that music through the entire video, by the way. The interesting thing about all these fights is that you actually do kill him after the first one, but later on he comes back as an unsent, basically a solid ghost that can't move on because they have unfinished business or died an unclean death. Not only that, but his death actually has a huge impact on the story. The heroes actually fight and kill him after finding out he was responsible for the death of his father, and wind up becoming fugitives as a result. The ironic thing is that even though his death has a huge impact on the story, even though he does come back, he might as well have died for how much he impacted the plot. I'm serious, after his death, he does pretty much nothing. Seymour only really sticks around because he's the character who best fills the traditional Final Fantasy villain role. And then there's his design. I mean, just look at him. Those hair antlers, that open-chested robe. I can hardly take him seriously as a villain because of just how silly he looks. Doesn't really help that his English voice sounds an awful lot like Winnie the Pooh.
I proposed to Lady Yuna as a maester of Yevon.
It's more friendly with 2.
I joke, but I really do like Seymour as a villain in spite of his failings. I mean, sure, his design is kind of laughable and he kind of drops out of the plot towards the end, but in spite of all of that, in his role as a dark reflection of the world the game creates, he does an excellent job. Yeah, I know, Exdeath is a tree. Go ahead, make your jokes. But as far as trees go, Exdeath is one of the scariest and most powerful. Long before the events of Final Fantasy V, the necromancer Enuo sealed thousands of demonic evil spirits within the Great Tree of Moor. He himself was eventually defeated, but his creation eventually gained sentience and, calling itself Exdeath, set out with only one goal: opening the void between dimensions and allowing it to consume everything that is. On the surface, his origin is really cliche, and in terms of motivation and subtlety, he really has none. But in spite of all the jokes about him just basically being a tree, he's one of the most scarily competent villains the series has ever had. He effortlessly tricks, controls, and manipulates everyone around him into destroying the crystals and the seal over him. And once the worlds are fused back together, he manages to obtain the power he so desperately sought, showing off his new power by pulling various chunks of the planet into the void, going out of his way to target the main character's hometowns, in a horrifying display of petty spite that few villains can match. Another memorable part of the character is his hamminess. In the original Super Nintendo version, the dialogue is pretty stock and unimpressive, but in the Game Boy Advance remake, the script was completely thrown out the window in favor of a more lighthearted, comedic, borderline parody of the fantasy genre. And Exdeath is really endearing in just how hammy he is, and he even gets some really funny lines here and there. His appearance in Dissidia cranks it up to 11. Every other line out of his mouth is about the void, how great the void is, how nothing compares to the void. Would you like to take a moment to hear about our Lord and Savior, the Void? The best part about him, however, is the scene halfway through the game where he kills Galuf, one of the main party members. Now, character death in Final Fantasy is nothing new, but this is one of the few times in the series where the main villain actually personally kills a main character. Even Kefka never managed that, and he's considered by many to be the best villain in the series. Is he going to be number 1 here? Well, we'll see. It does help that scene is one of the most epic moments in the entire series, or at the very least, the Super Nintendo games. The awesome final battles against him are just the icing on the cake. His final form is chaos incarnate. I mean, just look at that thing! His true nature as a nest of demons is pretty horrifying if you really think about it. Honestly, Exdeath is one of the biggest, baddest, most underrated villains in the entire series, and one who doesn't get nearly enough respect. I'm not going to spend too much time on Rubicante because he doesn't get a whole lot of screen time, but even as far as side villains go, he left quite a big impact on me my first time around. Now, the concept of the 4 elemental fiends has been in the series basically since day 1, but even though it originated in the first game, Final Fantasy IV took that concept and fully realized it, giving each of the fiends their own fully realized personalities. And by far the most memorable out of all of them was the fire fiend, Rubicante. When the player first encounters Rubicante, it cements him as a threat even after the other 3 have already been dealt with pretty handily. He's single-handedly responsible for the destruction of the Ninja Kingdom Eblan, and when its Prince Edge attempts to defeat him, Rubicante just swats him aside with little to no effort. He comes across as really arrogant, but at the same time, he has a right to be. When the player finally does get to fight him, the tried and true elemental weakness strategy doesn't work, as his cloak of fire is strong enough to repel ice, which the player has been trained to know works against ice by this point. The fight is one of many that forces the player to really think and pushes the boundaries of the battle system to its limits. However, there are 2 things about Rubicante that really set him apart from other villains of his caliber. The first is his code of ethics. When the aforementioned Edge learns that his parents, the king and queen, were captured by the villainous Dr. Lugier, sort of a prototype of Hojo, and transformed into Chimerae, Rubicante makes it clear that he had nothing to do with it and expresses disgust at the actions of his colleague. Then he fully heals the party's wounds just so he can have a fair fight, which is really honorable and sportsmanlike of him. The second is the rematch against him late in the game. In a rare move for any Final Fantasy villain, Rubicante thought to himself, hey, the heroes ganging up on me worked real well for them. I think I'll go get the other fiends and do the same thing to them. What follows is one of the best fights in the entire series, where you fight all 4 fiends right after another, in an exhausting final exam of a boss. You still get a free HP refill beforehand, which is pretty nice. I don't really have a whole lot else to say about him, just that he's a cool, competent, honorable henchman who leaves a huge impact despite his lack of screen time. Okay, tell me if the plot of Final Fantasy II sounds familiar. You have a rebellion fighting against an evil empire who has a really powerful superweapon, and the main character has a family member as an enemy agent dressed in black armor. Yeah, that does sound familiar, doesn't it? Final Fantasy just really likes ripping off Star Wars for some reason. In any case, as far as evil emperors go, Mateus is one of the better examples I've seen. There's not really much in the way of backstory for this guy. Heck, he didn't even have a name in his first appearance. Back then he was just called the Emperor. All we know about him is this. At some point, he made a deal with demonic forces and sold his soul to the devil for unlimited power and used that power to plow through the rest of the world with seemingly no resistance. In the process, he destroyed countless cities in his wake and killed a ton of people. Eventually, he gets killed by the heroes, but when the devil comes to collect, this guy murders the devil and takes over his position, making the capital of hell his stronghold. That is hardcore. Now, Final Fantasy II is a mixed bag, to put it lightly, but its greatest strength has always been in how it portrays war and death. Everything in the game has a bleak, hopeless atmosphere that permeates the entire game, and you feel the Emperor's hand in everything horrible that happens, despite the fact that you never meet him in person until like the halfway point of the game. His looming influence over the world goes so far that you'll barely notice his rather non-threatening design.
I told you already, I'm not David Bowie.
What else is there to talk about? Oh yeah, the fact that this guy killed the devil and took his place. I can't stress that fact enough. Bad guys in this series attaining a powerful final form is nothing new, but this guy became the actual devil. That's really hard to top, but it gets even better. The remakes of Final Fantasy II include a bonus campaign where you play as the characters who got killed off as they make their way through heaven, which is strangely dangerous. And when you get to the end, you find out that when the Emperor was killed, his good half split from his evil half, and his good half took over heaven. This guy is so evil that his good half is evil. He is not the most complex of characters, but he's one of those force of nature villains that doesn't really need a personality. He single-handedly lifted Final Fantasy II from a nigh-unplayable mess to a nigh-unplayable mess with huge emotional stakes. Hey, what gives? Someone spilled some Skyrim in my Final Fantasy game. Yes, it's another Final Fantasy XIV villain, and this one is from the game's first expansion, Heavensward. Long ago, the humans of Ishgard lived in peace with the dragons, and only Nidhogg was suspicious that something could go wrong. And eventually, something did go wrong when the villainous Ashians revealed to King Thordan that dragons' eyes could be used as sources of power, and Thordan went on to kill Nidhogg's sister, Ratatoskr, I think I'm pronouncing that right. In retaliation, Nidhogg attacked Ishgard, but he was defeated and his eyes were taken as well. After guilting his brother Hraesvelgr into lending him one of his own eyes, Nidhogg spent centuries relentlessly attempting to destroy Ishgard, not helped by the clergy presenting a fabricated version of events where Nidhogg attacked unprovoked. The result is an endless cycle of vengeance with both sides believing the other struck first. Here's the thing about dragons in Final Fantasy XIV. Because they live for thousands of years, they don't perceive time the same way we do. As a result, the wounds are still fresh in Nidhogg's mind even centuries later, and he refuses to see a distinction between the knights who killed his sister and their descendants who are none the wiser. If you ask me, the scariest villains are those that cannot be reasoned with. The characters try, mind you, but any and all attempts at diplomacy fall on deaf ears. Nidhogg succeeds primarily for two reasons. First, the sheer amount of build-up he gets. For the first half of Heavensward, and even before that, we never see him, but we keep hearing about his immense power, the threat he poses, his influence over the Dravanian horde, and the power exhibited by the One Eye in the possession of the heroes. And when we finally do meet him in person, he doesn't disappoint. He's huge. Not quite Smaug levels of huge, but still pretty huge. And while there is nothing about his design that makes him distinct from the other dragons, like, say, Hraesvelgr, he definitely stands out compared to the other villains of 14 at least. But more interestingly, he's a scarily effective parallel to one of Heavensward's primary characters, Estinian. Estinian, also known as the Azure Dragoon, lost his family to one of Nidhogg's attacks and was driven to a desire for vengeance, and this drive for revenge nearly compromises the hero's attempt to restore peace multiple times. And eventually, Estinian does succeed in killing Nidhogg. Dude, are you gonna take a shower at some point? No? You're just gonna keep going around with that armor? Okay. But once this happens, Nidhogg lives on through the eyes and takes over Estinian's body. Now, I'm usually kind of iffy when a villain is possessed or mind-controlled or something, but in this case it really works because of how similar the two are. Both of them have been consumed by a desire for revenge to a degree, so it does kind of make sense story-wise that it would happen, and it actually does add to the drama. His design while possessing Estinian is also really cool and creepy, but it is sadly pretty underused compared to his normal dragon form. Top it all off with his beautiful and epic theme music, and you've got yourself one of the more effective big bads in Final Fantasy XIV's run.